Hold still, sweetheart. I want to see how cheap wine looks on whatever you're trying to be. Caspian Harrington smirked as he raised the crystal goblet above Vespera Thorne's head. The 19-year-old's grin widened as the Bordeaux cascaded down her midnight black hair, staining her crimson silk gown while guests gasped in collective shock. Eleonora Harrington clapped delightedly. "Oh, Caspian, perfect! She matches the decor now," she purred, angling her phone to capture the humiliation. Sterling approached with measured steps, his cold eyes assessing the wine-soaked woman. "Do try not to drip on the imported marble," he murmured. "This venue has standards." Vespera didn't move. Her dark eyes locked onto Caspian with an intensity that made several nearby guests instinctively step back. None of them understood that they had just humiliated the daughter of Victor the Silencer Thorne, the most feared man in the city's underworld. A man who had built an empire on one unbreakable rule: disrespect must always be answered. Before the crystal chandeliers of the Harrington Foundation's grand ballroom cast dancing shadows across marble floors imported from Carrara. Hundreds of guests in designer evening wear had turned when Vespera Thorne made her entrance, her crimson silk gown catching the light like liquid fire. She moved with the quiet confidence that had become her signature in the art world, acknowledging scattered nods with a practiced smile. At 28, Vespera commanded attention not through ostentation or volume, but through presence. The kind of presence that made people wonder about the story behind those dark, knowing eyes. Her midnight black hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, framing a face that belonged on old Hollywood film posters. Delicate diamond earrings caught the light with each subtle movement. She'd built Galerie Noire from a small studio into one of the city's most exclusive contemporary art spaces, and tonight was meant to celebrate that achievement. Her gallery had just been featured in Art Forum's Rising Stars Under 30. "Miss Thorne." Several art collectors stepped forward to greet her, but before she could respond, a commotion rippled through the crowd. Preston Harrington III shouldered his way through the gathered guests, crystal goblet in hand, while Vespera watched his approach with the detached interest of someone studying a painting. "Tonight, I'm just Vespera," she reminded herself, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a graduation gift from her father, though the invitation had listed her simply as V. Thorne, gallery owner. No mention of Victor, no whispers of the Black Lotus Syndicate. Just another successful businesswoman at another gilded fundraiser. She'd worked years to build this legitimate identity, brick by careful brick, distancing herself from the shadow of her father's empire. Tonight was supposed to be about art and philanthropy, not blood and loyalty. Caspian's smirk widened as he drew closer, his prep school friends trailing behind with phones already raised. "Nice dress," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Rent it for the evening, or is Daddy's money finally running out?" His eyes swept over her crimson gown with practiced disdain, the kind only old money could perfect. Before Vespera could respond, his arm shot forward. The Bordeaux arced through the air in slow motion, splashing across her face and chest. The expensive silk absorbed the wine like a wound, spreading crimson into deeper crimson. Droplets pattered onto the imported marble as the ballroom fell into shocked silence. Then Eleonora's delighted laughter shattered it. "Oh, Caspian, perfect! She matches the decor now." Her phone was already recording, capturing every second of Vespera's humiliation for posterity. Sterling Harrington materialized beside his son, assessing the damage with cold satisfaction. "Do try not to drip on the imported marble," he murmured, straightening his cufflinks. "This venue has standards." Vespera stood perfectly still, feeling the wine seep into her hair, her skin, the careful facade she'd constructed over years. Around her, phones appeared like fireflies, recording, uploading, sharing. The viral moment was already being born, but she barely noticed. Her dark eyes had locked onto Caspian with an intensity that made him falter, his triumphant grin flickering. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying that particular quiet that demanded attention. She stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You should have asked who I was first." Something in her tone, silk wrapped around a blade, made Caspian's face drain of color. The Thorn name meant nothing to these people, insulated as they were in their world of charity galas and summer homes. But somewhere in his privileged, sheltered mind, a primal instinct recognized danger when it smiled at him. Vespera turned and walked toward the exit, wine still dripping from her hair, her spine straight as steel. The crowd parted like water. Some guests were still filming, but others, those with connections to the city's darker corners, had gone very quiet. One elderly man in the corner set down his champagne glass with a trembling hand, his face ashen. He recognized the name. He knew what it meant. By the time Vespera's driver opened the door to her town car, the video had been viewed 100,000 times. In a penthouse across the city, Victor, the silencer, Thorn, watched his phone screen in absolute stillness. Around him, his associates had begun to gather without being summoned. They'd all seen the video. All felt the rage building in the room like a storm front. "She wants to handle this herself," Victor said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the underworld. He set down his phone with careful precision. "So we wait." He looked up at the men assembled before him, and his eyes held the promise of violence held barely in check. But not for long. Vespera arrived at Galerie Noire before dawn, the wine-stained gown replaced by tailored black trousers and a silk blouse. She'd barely slept, spending the night watching her humiliation multiply across social media. 2 million views now, with comments ranging from outraged support to vicious mockery. Her hands were steady as she unlocked the gallery door, but the careful control cost her. The police station smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Detective Morrison barely looked up from his paperwork as she filed her report, describing the assault in precise detail. When she finished, he set down his pen with a heavy sigh. "Kids will be kids, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "Rich boy acting out at a party. These things happen." He poured wine on me deliberately, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Morrison's expression shifted to something resembling pity. "The Harringtons are well connected. My advice, let it go. You don't want that kind of trouble." Her lawyer, Marcus Chen, called 3 hours later with worse news. "They buried the civil suit before it could be filed. Their legal team is 20 attorneys deep, Vespera. They're claiming you provoked the incident, that it was a harmless prank you're exploiting for attention." His voice dropped. "They're also implying you're trying to social climb by targeting their family." By noon, the media narrative had crystallized into something unrecognizable. Cable news played Caspian's interview on loop. The boy who'd sneered at her now sobbing convincingly about an aggressive woman who'd made him uncomfortable at a family event. Sterling and Eleonora flanked him like concerned parents, their performance impeccable. "She kept staring at our son," Eleonora told the cameras, dabbing her eyes. "We think she was trying to create an incident to gain publicity for her struggling gallery." The headlines followed predictably. "Gallery owner attacks beloved charity family. Social climber targets Harrington heir. Woman claims assault after inappropriate behavior at gala." Vespera's phone buzzed. "Papa, say the word, moja doch." Victor's voice was soft, almost gentle. "And this ends tonight." She closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "I left that world, Papa. I won't go back." "You never left. You only pretended you could." a pause heavy with unspoken understanding. But I will respect your choice. For now. Yet over the following days, her father's presence manifested like shadows at twilight. The mechanic who serviced her car, new, attentive, always watching the street. The waitress at her usual cafe who slipped her coffee to her with a knowing nod. Her driver, suddenly replaced with a silent man whose eyes missed nothing. All of them, Black Lotus. All of them appearing unbidden like chess pieces moving into defensive positions. She wanted to be angry, but she recognized it for what it was. Her father's love, expressed in the only language he knew. Protection through power. The manila envelope arrived on the fourth morning, slipped under her gallery door while she was upstairs. No return address, no note. Inside, a complete dossier on the Harrington family. Financial records, offshore accounts, shipping manifests, private correspondence. Evidence of crimes buried under layers of respectability and wealth. Vespera spread the documents across her desk, her hands trembling slightly. This evidence was obtained illegally, fruit of the poisonous tree, as Marcus would say, inadmissible in any court. But as a roadmap? As a guide to where legitimate investigation should look? She reached for her phone, her reflection catching in the darkened window, a woman standing at the intersection of two worlds, about to step deliberately into the space between. The legitimate path had failed. Perhaps it was time to walk a different road. The dossier became Vespera's obsession, its contents sprawling across her private office like a map of corruption. She started with Vance Logistics, Sterling's crown jewel, a shipping empire built on his grandfather's fortune. The public record showed container ships, warehouses, import-export licenses. Legitimate on the surface. But the wiretap recordings told a different story. Sterling's voice crackled through her laptop speakers, discussing shipments with coded language that wasn't quite coded enough. The special cargo arrives Thursday. Route it through the usual channels, Malta, then Cyprus. Another voice confirmed. 30 crates, small arms, as requested. Vespera's hands stilled on the keyboard. Arms dealing. Not the occasional handgun, but military-grade weapons shipped to sanctioned nations, to organizations on watch lists. The manifests showed discrepancies, containers that weighed far more than their declared contents, customs officials who consistently approved suspicious shipments without inspection. She moved to Eleonora next, the charity queen whose foundation claimed to fund cancer research. The tax filings were public record, professionally audited, impeccably presented. 97% administrative costs seemed high, but not illegal. Then she found the private accounts. Millions flowing from the Harrington Foundation into offshore holdings, then resurfacing as purchases. A yacht docked in Monaco, a villa in Positano, jewelry from Cartier, art from Sotheby's. Children died waiting for treatment while Eleonora bought her third vacation home. The third folder made Vespera's blood run cold. Marcus Rivera, 34 years old, father of 3, pronounced dead at the scene of a hit-and-run 2 years ago. The police report was thin. No witnesses came forward. Traffic cameras had malfunctioned. The investigation went cold within weeks, but the Black Lotus had found what the police hadn't. A partial license plate from a private security camera, trace paint transfer that matched a Maserati registered to Caspian Harrington, witness statements that were taken and then mysteriously lost. Vespera found Sofia Rivera in a modest apartment in Queens, working 2 jobs to support her children. The woman's eyes held the particular exhaustion of grief that never quite healed. "The police said it was random," Sofia whispered, her hands wrapped around cold coffee. "They said Marcus was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But someone called me 3 days after he died, offered me money to stop asking questions. When I refused, they threatened my children." Vespera's throat tightened. "I'm going to make this right. Can you? Sophia's smile was bitter. They have everything. Money, connections, power. People like us, we don't matter to people like them. Back at the gallery, Vespera called the one prosecutor she thought might help, Sarah Mendez, known for her integrity. She laid out everything, the arms deals, the charity fraud, the hit-and-run cover-up. Sarah listened in heavy silence. I can't touch this, Vespera. You know I can't. This evidence, how it was obtained, it's fruit of the poisonous tree. Any case I built would collapse in pre-trial motions. So they just get away with it? Unless you can find legally obtained evidence that leads to the same conclusions. Sarah's voice carried a weight of frustration. The legitimate world has rules. Sometimes those rules protect the wrong people. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The legitimate world has different rules for people like them. Vespera stared at the dossier, at Sofia Rivera's address written in her own hand, at the evidence of crimes buried under wealth and influence. The system was designed to protect the Harringtons. Perhaps it was time to use a system they didn't control. Vespera sent the evidence to 3 investigative journalists simultaneously, each one known for exposing corporate corruption. Within hours, all 3 declined. The first cited insufficient corroboration. The second mentioned legal concerns. The third was more honest. I received a call from the Harrington legal team. They are prepared to bury me and my publication in litigation. I have a family to feed. I'm sorry. She tried the networks next, then independent media outlets, then anonymous tips to federal agencies. Every door closed before she could get her foot in it. The Harringtons' reach was longer than she'd imagined, their influence more pervasive. Then Sterling struck back. The federal agents arrived at dawn, battering ram unnecessary. They simply cut through the gallery's locks. Vespera watched from her apartment window as they swarmed Gallery Noir like ants, carrying boxes of records, computers, her entire business infrastructure. Anonymous tip regarding money laundering, the lead agent explained, his expression apologetic but firm. Financial transfers from known criminal enterprises to your accounts. We're required to investigate. The fake records were masterful. Years of fabricated transactions showing millions flowing from Black Lotus shell companies into Vespera's gallery. Purchase orders for art that never existed. Sales to buyers who were really her father's associates. A paper trail that painted her legitimate business as an elaborate laundering operation. Her accounts froze within the hour. Gallery, personal savings, investment portfolios, all seized pending investigation. Her apartment was next, then her vehicles. The life she'd built over a decade disappeared in 48 hours. The media descended like vultures. "Mafia princess wears mask of respectability," screamed the headlines. Cable news ran endless loops of her gallery being raided, contrasted with old surveillance photos of her father. Talking heads speculated about how long she'd been running a criminal enterprise under the guise of art dealing. Sterling's press conference was a masterpiece of manufactured righteousness. We suspected something was amiss when Ms. Thorne began harassing our family. Her desperate attempts to damage our reputation were clearly designed to distract from her own criminal activities. Justice prevails over criminal dynasties. Vespera sat in her ransacked gallery that night, surrounded by empty walls where paintings once hung. The legitimate identity she'd fought for, sacrificed for, was gone. Destroyed not through her own actions, but through the same corrupt power she'd tried to escape. Her phone rang. "Papa, are you ready to do this properly now?" She looked around at the ruins of her carefully constructed life, at the legitimate world that had failed her twice, once by refusing to punish the Harringtons, again by allowing them to destroy her without evidence or trial. The realization settled over her like winter. Both worlds were corrupt. Her father bought his power with blood and fear. The Harringtons bought theirs with money and connections. Different currency, same transaction. The only difference was which one pretended to be righteous. "Yes, Papa." Her voice was steady, emptied of illusion. "But we do it my way." "And what way is that, moja doch?" Vespera stood, brushing dust from her clothes, her reflection catching in a broken mirror. A woman who'd tried to be something she wasn't, finally accepting what she'd always been. "We use your resources to gather their crimes legally. We expose them through channels they can't corrupt. We prove that intelligence networks aren't inherently evil. It's how you use them." Victor's rare laugh carried approval. "You've learned something I never could. Come home, daughter. Let me introduce you to people who've been waiting to meet you." She walked out of the gallery without looking back, leaving behind the wreckage of Vespera Thorne, gallery owner. What emerged would be something far more dangerous. Victor's penthouse occupied the top floor of a building that officially belonged to a textile import company. Vespera stepped from the private elevator into a space she hadn't entered in 6 years. All dark wood and leather, maps of the city marked with territories and influence, the smell of expensive cigars and older money. 3 people waited around the conference table, and she recognized each from childhood memories deliberately buried. Nikolai Volkov stood first, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Former KGB, now Victor's intelligence architect. Little Vespera, not so little anymore. Beside him, Yuki Tanaka, a woman who'd once been a forensic accountant for Interpol before disappearing into the Black Lotus network. And Marcus Webb, the lawyer who'd faked his death rather than defend a cartel boss, now operating from the shadows with Victor's protection. "My daughter has a proposal," Victor said, gesturing for Vespera to begin. She laid out her conditions with the same precision she'd once used for gallery exhibitions. No violence, no intimidation, no traditional mafia tactics. We use your resources, your intelligence networks, your international contacts, your ability to see what others miss, but everything we gather must be legally obtained and legally usable. Nikolai frowned. "That severely limits our—" "It changes our methodology," Vespera interrupted, "not our effectiveness. You know where to look. You know who to ask. You know which security cameras work and which don't. Which restaurants Sterling frequents, which shipping routes Vance Logistics actually uses. That knowledge isn't illegal. Acting on it legally is just creative investigation." Yuki leaned forward, understanding sparking in her eyes. "We become intelligence consultants for legitimate law enforcement. We point them toward evidence they can use in court." "Exactly." Vespera pulled up the dossier on her tablet. Sterling's arms deals, Eleonora's charity fraud, Caspian's hit and run. We find proof that can survive legal scrutiny, then deliver it to the few prosecutors and federal agents not in the Harringtons' pocket. Victor watched his daughter with an expression she'd rarely seen, pride mixed with something like wonder. "You're not rejecting what you are, moja doch. You're evolving it." The operation unfolded over 3 weeks with surgical precision. Nikolai's international network, contacts in Malta, Cyprus, Morocco, provided legally obtained shipping manifests, customs records, photographs of containers being loaded and unloaded. Everything was public record. They simply knew which records to request. Yuki dissected Eleonora's foundation with the patience of someone who'd spent decades following money trails. She filed freedom of information requests, cross-referenced tax filings with real estate purchases, tracked wire transfers through publicly accessible banking records. The fraud revealed itself in spreadsheets and legal documents. The hit and run required different tactics. Marcus found the restaurant where Sterling dined every Thursday, a public place with security cameras. Not Black Lotus cameras. Legal surveillance that happened to capture Sterling's conversation with his lawyer 2 years ago. Make sure that Rivera incident stays buried, whatever it costs. Caspian was drunk, but he's still my son. We're using a criminal network to enable legitimate justice, Marcus said quietly, reviewing the footage. I never thought I'd see the day. Vespera looked at the evidence accumulating around them. Paper trails, witness testimonies from people no longer afraid to speak, digital forensics that would hold up in any court. We're proving that intelligence networks aren't inherently evil. It's how you use them. Power isn't good or bad. It's the choice that defines morality. Victor raised his glass of vodka. To my daughter, who found a third way. The evidence hit simultaneously at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. FBI headquarters received encrypted files detailing Vance Logistics' arms trafficking network, shipping manifests, wire transfers, photographs of weapons containers, communications with sanctioned regimes. Interpol got the international connections, routes through Malta and Cyprus, buyers in Tehran and Pyongyang, a decade of illegal arms sales disguised as commercial shipping. The SEC received Eleanora's charity fraud in meticulous detail, while the International Criminal Court got documentation of weapons sold to organizations on terrorist watch lists. At 6:05 a.m., every major news outlet received the full dossier. By 6:30, the first headlines appeared. Harrington Empire built on illegal arms trade. Cable news ran photographs of shipping containers being loaded in foreign ports, weapons visible through gaps in the cargo. Sterling's own voice played over the footage discussing special shipments and usual channels. Eleanora's fraud dominated the human interest angle. The networks found families whose children had died waiting for cancer treatment, while the Harrington Foundation claimed insufficient funds. They juxtaposed these stories with photos of Eleanora's yacht, purchased the same month 3 children died in hospice care. Then came Marcus Rivera's footage. The mysteriously recovered traffic camera showed Caspian's Maserati running a red light at 40 miles over the speed limit, striking Marcus in a crosswalk, never slowing. The restaurant security footage showed Sterling ordering the cover-up. And on live television, Sofia Rivera faced the camera with tears streaming down her face. They took my husband. They took my children's father. And then they paid people to forget he ever existed. Federal agents moved at dawn, descending on the Harrington mansion with warrants and battering rams. Sterling wasn't there. He'd already fled toward his private airfield, a jet fueled and ready for a non-extradition country. Nikolai's voice crackled over Vespera's phone. He's heading to Teterboro. Customs is waiting. Sterling made it to the tarmac before federal marshals surrounded his vehicle. The news helicopters captured everything, his desperate sprint toward the jet, agents tackling him to the ground, handcuffs glinting in the morning sun. His face pressed against concrete, blood from a split lip staining his custom suit. Eleanora's arrest came during a live television interview where she'd been attempting damage control. Agents entered the studio mid-sentence, reading her rights while cameras rolled. Her mascara ran in black rivers as she screamed about persecution and family legacy, the careful composure finally shattering completely. Caspian broke within hours. In the interrogation room, faced with traffic camera footage and his father's recorded orders, he confessed to everything. The hit and run, the cover-up, even crimes the investigators hadn't known about. He begged for a deal, offered testimony against his parents, wept like the child he'd been when he learned cruelty from masters. The stock market opened to chaos. Vance Logistics crashed, trading halted at minus 73%. Assets froze worldwide as international agencies coordinated seizures. The Harrington name, once synonymous with philanthropy and old money, became shorthand for corruption masked as respectability. Through it all, Victor Thorne remained invisible. No photographs, no statements, no trace of Black Lotus involvement. But in federal offices, certain investigators noticed the precision of the operation, the impossibility of such coordinated evidence gathering without serious resources. Detective Chen studied the files late that night, then pulled up Vespera Thorne's case, the money laundering charges that had appeared so conveniently, now clearly fabricated. He looked at her name for a long moment, then at her father's file, then closed both without comment. Some wars, he murmured to his empty office, aren't worth fighting. The trials dominated 3 news cycles, each verdict landing with the weight of inevitability. Sterling Harrington received life without parole for arms trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and violations of international weapons sanctions. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. You used your privilege as a shield while profiting from weapons that killed thousands. This court shows you the mercy you never showed your victims, which is to say, none. Eleonora got 30 years for fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and tax evasion. She wept throughout sentencing, her designer clothes replaced by prison orange, her carefully maintained image reduced to a mugshot that would define her legacy. Caspian's testimony against his parents earned him 15 years with possibility of parole. At 20, he would spend his prime years in federal prison, learning consequences his family had never taught him. He'd looked at Vespera once during his testimony, seeking forgiveness or understanding. She'd looked through him like glass. The FBI dismissed all charges against Vespera within a week, issuing a formal apology. The evidence against Ms. Thorne was fabricated as part of the Harringtons' campaign to silence her investigation into their criminal enterprises. We regret any harm caused by their manipulation of our processes. Sofia Rivera stood in federal court as the judge awarded her family $50 million from seized Harrington assets. She wept, not from joy, but from the validation that her husband's life had mattered, that justice, delayed and imperfect, had finally arrived. Other victims emerged like ghosts from the Harringtons' past. Employees discriminated against, business partners defrauded, families destroyed by Sterling's weapons sales. The class action lawsuit consumed what remained of the estate, distributing wealth built on suffering back to those who'd suffered. Vance Logistics ceased to exist. Assets were sold, contracts dissolved, employees absorbed by legitimate companies that actually paid fair wages and followed laws. The Harrington name was stripped from buildings, foundations, scholarship funds. History would remember them only as a cautionary tale. The auction of Harrington properties took place on a cold November morning. The Spera arrived in a black coat and simple jewelry, her presence causing whispers among the assembled buyers. She bid methodically on 2 properties, the corporate headquarters and the ballroom venue where Caspian wore hid the wine. Both were hers by noon. Victor Thorne entered halfway through the auction, the first time he'd been seen publicly with his daughter in over 6 years. Cameras flashed. Reporters recognized him immediately, the pieces falling into place, the precision of the investigation, the international coordination, the resources required to topple an empire. She's Victor Thorne's daughter, one journalist whispered to another. They never had a chance. But an older reporter, one who'd covered organized crime for 3 decades, shook his head. No, she's Vespera Thorne. Look at how this was done. No violence, no intimidation, everything legal and public. She did this her way. Father and daughter stood together as the gavel fell on the final property. Victor's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of approval that spoke volumes in its rarity. "What will you do with them?" he asked quietly. The Spera looked at the deeds in her hands, the spoils of war transformed into tools for peace. Something they never could. Something that matters. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the city in white, making everything clean again. The Harrington headquarters stood empty, stripped of its arrogance. Vespera walked through rooms where Sterling had orchestrated arms deals and Eleonora had embezzled from dying children, her footsteps echoing off marble floors that would soon serve a different purpose. She stopped in what had been Sterling's corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and spread architectural plans across his abandoned desk. "The Second Chance Initiative," she said aloud, testing the words. The mission crystallized as she worked. Help families affected by organized crime build legitimate businesses. Not charity, but opportunity. Job training, microloans, legal protection, business mentorship. Everything her father's world had destroyed, she would help rebuild, using his resources but channeling them toward legal enterprise. Sofia Rivera arrived on a Tuesday morning, hesitant but curious. Vespera offered her the position of family support director without preamble. "Why me?" Sofia asked, her voice still carrying the weight of grief. "Because you understand the cost. Because you've survived what this initiative exists to prevent. Because your husband's memory deserves to become something that helps others." Sofia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Marcus would have liked that. Victor's people came next, not as enforcers, but as volunteers. Nikolai, who'd spent decades in intelligence, taught digital security to former gang members trying to start tech companies. Yuki used her forensic accounting expertise to help entrepreneurs navigate legitimate finance. Marcus Webb emerged from the shadows to provide legal counsel to those who couldn't afford it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A crime syndicate's resources creating legitimate opportunities, blood money carefully laundered into clean investments that built rather than destroyed. The first graduates opened their businesses 6 months later. A former Bratva enforcer launched a construction company employing other men trying to leave that life. 2 sisters whose father had been killed in cartel violence opened a restaurant. A young man who'd grown up in the drug trade started a tech repair shop, his hands that once moved product, now fixing computers. The media eventually found the story. "Mafia Princess redefines family business," read the headline, but the interview that followed was more nuanced than Vespera expected. "You've transformed your father's empire into something legitimate," the reporter said. "How do you reconcile that?" Vespera met the camera's lens directly. Power isn't inherently good or evil. It's what you choose to do with it. My father built an empire on fear and control. I'm using those same resources, the money, the connections, the expertise, to give people choices he would have taken away. That's not reconciliation. It's evolution. Across the city, Victor watched the interview in his penthouse office, surrounded by maps that marked territories and influenced decades of carefully maintained control. His expression, rare for a man called the Silencer, was something approaching a smile. His phone was in his hand before the interview ended. "You found a better way, moja doc," he said when Vespera answered. His voice carried a depth of emotion he rarely allowed himself. "A way I never could have imagined. I'm proud of you." Vespera stood at the window of her reclaimed office, looking out at a city that held both her father's darkness and her own light. "I didn't reject what I am, Papa. I just chose what to become." "That," Victor said softly, "is wisdom I spent a lifetime never learning." 1 year later, the same crystal chandeliers cast light across the same marble floors, but everything else had changed. The ballroom that once housed the Harrington Foundation's display of wealth now hosted the annual Second Chance Initiative Gala, celebrating 50 new businesses launched and 200 families given opportunities they'd never imagined possible. Sofia Rivera stood on stage accepting the evening's highest honor, a scholarship established in Marcus's name that would send children of crime victims to college. Her voice no longer carried the hollow weight of grief, but something harder and more hopeful, purpose forged from pain. The media filled the back rows, but this time their cameras captured triumph instead of humiliation, success stories instead of shame. The Spera arrived as the sun set, her midnight blue gown echoing the crimson dress wine had ruined a year ago. The room rose as one, applause building like thunder. She walked the same path Caspian had intercepted, but now every step belonged to her. Her speech was brief, each word chosen with the precision she'd learned from two very different educations. A year ago, someone tried to humiliate me in this room. They thought I was powerless. They were wrong, but not for the reasons they feared. She paused, letting the words settle.